The conference chamber floated in the void between stars. A massive structure built by 12 ancient civilizations over the course of 3,000 years. And today, it held the most important gathering in galactic history because something was eating the universe and nobody knew how to stop it. The Void Cascade had appeared 6 months ago in the Outer Rim territories, a phenomenon that looked like a wound in space itself, where stars simply ceased to exist, and the darkness spread like infection through living tissue, consuming everything it touched and leaving behind nothing but empty space that sensors could not even penetrate. Council member Zarthon of the Zarkathi stood at the central podium with all 4 of his arms spread wide in a gesture of desperation that his species had not used in 10,000 years of recorded history, and his voice carried the weight of inevitable doom when he spoke to the assembled delegates. "We have tried everything," he said, and his translator device rendered his clicking speech into 100 different languages, simultaneously for the benefit of all present. "Our greatest minds have studied this phenomenon, and we have deployed every technology at our disposal, and the cascade continues to expand." The holographic display at the center of the chamber showed the most recent data, and it was terrifying in its simplicity, because the red zone representing the cascade now covered 47 star systems, and the projection models showed it would reach the core worlds within 18 months if nothing changed. High Chancellor Vex of the Luminae collective hummed a frequency that translated as profound sorrow, and her crystalline body refracted the chamber lights into rainbow patterns across the walls when she added her own assessment to the grim proceedings. "Evacuation is our only option now," she said with resignation clear in every harmonic. "We cannot save the systems, but we can save some of the populations if we begin immediately and coordinate our efforts across all member species." The chamber erupted in a chaos of voices and sounds as delegates from 12 different species all tried to speak at once, because evacuation meant abandoning billions of citizens to certain death, and choosing who lived and who died was not something any of them wanted to face. Commander Karas of the Vorosh Defense Fleet slammed his massive fist against his seat, and the metallic clang silenced the room instantly, because the Arish were warriors first, and they did not accept defeat. "Easily unacceptable," he growled in a voice like grinding stones. "My people have never run from a fight, and we will not start now, even if the enemy is the void itself." But even as he spoke those words, everyone in the chamber knew they were empty bravado, because what could anyone fight when the enemy was not a fleet or an army, but reality itself coming undone at the seams? The human delegation sat quietly in their assigned seats near the back of the chamber, because Earth had only joined the Galactic Council 20 years ago, and humanity was still considered young and inexperienced, compared to civilizations that had been traveling between stars for millions of years. Ambassador James Rodriguez watched the proceedings with dark eyes that missed nothing, and beside him sat Dr. Sarah Chen, who kept running calculations on her portable terminal, even as the council debated their options. "We could try." Sarah whispered to the ambassador in English, which their translation devices kept private between them. "The math is insane, but it might work." James looked at her with the expression of someone who had heard too many crazy human ideas over his career, but had also seen enough of them succeed to know better than to dismiss them outright. "They will think we are mad." He whispered back to her, "They already think that." Sarah replied with a slight smile. "We are the species that strapped rockets to our backs before we even understood orbital mechanics properly, and we colonized Mars using equipment that the Zarkathi consider primitive mining tools." The debate continued for another hour with various delegates proposing and dismissing solutions that ranged from attempting to contain the cascade with force fields to trying to outrun it by accelerating the expansion of their own territory in the opposite direction. Finally, Ambassador Rodriguez stood up and cleared his throat, and the sound somehow carried through the massive chamber, despite his lack of any impressive physical features compared to the other species present. "The human delegation requests permission to address the council," he said in formal galactic standard that his translator rendered perfectly, despite humanity's relative inexperience with the language. Zarthan looked down at the human with all 4 eyes blinking in sequence, which among his people indicated surprise mixed with skepticism, because humans rarely spoke during council sessions, and when they did, it was usually to propose something that violated at least 3 fundamental laws of physics. The council recognizes Earth's delegation, Zarthon said with audible reluctance. Please share your thoughts, Ambassador Rodriguez, though. I warn you that we have already exhausted every conventional approach. James gestured for Sarah to stand, and she did so with the tablet clutched in her hands like a shield against the attention of species that had been building quantum computers. When humanity's ancestors were still learning to make fire, we have a proposal. Sarah began in a voice that shook slightly at first, but grew stronger as she continued. Instead of trying to stop the cascade or run from it, we suggest using it. The chamber fell into absolute silence that stretched for several seconds before. Chancellor Vex's harmonic laugh filled the space with a sound like crystal bells shattering against marble floors. Use it, she asked, in a tone that mixed amusement with pity. Young human, you clearly do not understand what the void cascade represents if you think it can be harnessed like some sort of natural resource. But Sarah held her ground and projected her calculations onto the main display where they appeared as incomprehensible strings of numbers and symbols that made several of the assembled scientists lean forward with sudden interest. Despite themselves, we propose introducing controlled disruptions into the cascade's expansion pattern, Sarah explained while highlighting different sections of her work. By creating quantum instabilities at specific points, we can force the phenomenon to destabilize itself from within. Commander Karras snorted in derision, and his scales rattled. With the sound of his disbelief when he spoke up from his position across the chamber, "You want to make the problem worse?" he asked incredulously. "Your solution to a phenomenon that destroys matter is to attack it with more destruction." "Exactly," Sarah replied without hesitation. "The cascade operates on principles we don't fully understand, but we know it requires a certain level of quantum coherence to maintain its structure. And if we disrupt that coherence sufficiently, the entire thing should collapse." Zarthon studied the human's calculations for a long moment, and his expression shifted through several configurations that his species used to indicate deep thought mixed with profound doubt. "This is madness," he finally declared. "You are proposing to fly ships directly into a phenomenon that unmakes matter at the quantum level and somehow survive long enough to deploy weapons we are not even certain will function, and all of this based on theoretical calculations that have never been tested." "Yes," James said, simply because there was no point in denying the obvious truth. "But right now, madness is the only option you have left that is not simply waiting to die." The vote took 3 hours of debate in several recesses where delegates consulted with their home governments across the vast distances of space using quantum communication devices. And in the end, the measure passed by the narrowest possible margin because desperation made even the most cautious civilizations willing to try the impossible. Humanity was given permission to attempt their insane solution with the understanding that if they failed, the Council would proceed with evacuation plans immediately. As the human delegation left the chamber, Sarah looked at James with eyes that reflected both excitement and terror in equal measure. "We actually have to do this now," she said. "I know," James replied. "God help us all." The human fleet assembled at Rally Point Theta looked like a collection of scrap metal compared to the sleek vessels of other Council species. But every ship bristled with weapons and equipment that made the gathered observers shake their heads. In a mixture of horror and fascination, Commander Marcus Webb stood on the bridge of the flagship, indomitable, and reviewed the mission parameters for the 100th time, because once they entered the cascade, there would be no room for error or second chances. "All ships report ready status," his communications officer announced from her station. "We have 37 vessels, including 12 modified haulers carrying the quantum disruption devices." Marcus nodded and looked out at the gathered fleet through the main view screen, where ships bearing names like Defiant and Unbreakable and Universal Never Surrender floated in formation against the backdrop of distant stars. Dr. Sarah Chen worked at a console near the captain's chair, and her fingers flew across holographic controls as she made final adjustments to the calculations that would either save billions of lives or kill everyone in the human fleet within the next 72 hours. "The Council observers are requesting another delay," the communications officer said with obvious frustration. They want us to run more simulations before we proceed. Tell them we are out of time, Marcus replied. Without looking away from the view screen, the cascade has consumed 3 more. System, since we got approval and every hour we wait means more people die, the truth was that. Marcus had his own doubts about this mission because everything about it violated basic military doctrine and common sense. But he had fought in enough desperate situations to know that sometimes the only way forward was straight through the fire. Sarah finished her calculations and turned to face the commander with an expression that tried to project confidence, but could not quite hide the fear underneath the disruption points are programmed into the navigation systems. She said, "Each ship knows exactly where to deploy their devices, and the timing sequences are synchronized down to the nanosecond. Will it work?" Marcus asked her directly because he needed to hear the truth from someone who understood the science behind their desperate gambler. Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering honestly, "I don't know, and that is the most truthful answer I can give you, because we are attempting something that has never been done before, using technology we invented 3 weeks ago." Marcus appreciated her honesty, even if it was not the reassurance he had hoped for, and he activated the fleet-wide communication channel so his voice would reach every ship.
"Simultaneously, this is Commander Webb to all vessels."
He began in a steady voice that had commanded soldiers through hell more times than he cared to remember. "In a few minutes, we are going to do something that every expert in the galaxy says is impossible, and they are probably right, but being told something cannot be done has never stopped humanity." Before he paused and looked around his own bridge, at the crew members who had volunteered for this mission knowing they might not return, and he saw determination in every face. Our ancestors crossed oceans in wooden boats when everyone said the world was flat. Marcus continued. They flew into space strapped to barely controlled explosions when everyone said it was suicide, and they colonized Mars when everyone said humans could never survive there. So today we are going to stop a phenomenon that unmakes reality because someone needs to try. It might as well be us. The channel filled with cheers and shouts from 37 different ships as humanity prepared to attempt the impossible. One more time, the Galactic Council observers watched from their safe distance as the human fleet began its approach toward the cascade, and the viewing chamber filled with delegates from every member species, because none of them wanted to miss witnessing either humanity's greatest triumph or their. Spectacular Extinction Zarthon stood at the central observation platform with all 4 of his arms crossed in a posture that indicated deep concern, and he spoke quietly to Chancellor Vex, who hovered beside him in her crystalline form. "They are actually going through with it," he said in a tone that mixed admiration with horror. "I did not truly believe they would proceed once they saw the cascade up close. Humans are nothing if not committed to their insanity." Vex replied while her body refracted the chamber lights nervously. "I confess I do not know whether to hope they succeed or grieve for their inevitable deaths." The main display showed the human fleet from multiple angles as they accelerated toward the cascade's event horizon. And the sight made every observer's equivalent of blood run cold because the phenomenon looked like a hole in space itself, where reality simply stopped existing. Commander Karas watched with the intense focus of a predator, studying potential prey, and despite his earlier skepticism, he found himself impressed by the humans. Courage, if nothing else, they fly toward certain death without hesitation. He rumbled to himself, "Perhaps this young species has more warrior spirit than I credited." Then the human fleet reached the outer boundary of the cascade, and the sensors immediately began registering impossible readings as the laws of physics started breaking down in the presence of the phenomenon. Entering the disruption zone now, Marcus announced to his crew as the Indomitable shuddered from forces that should not exist. "All ships maintain formation and prepare to deploy devices on my mark." The view screen showed reality itself coming apart around them as stars vanished, in space twisted into shapes that hurt to look at directly. But Marcus kept his eyes fixed on the navigation display, where green indicators showed each ship's position relative to their assigned disruption points. Sarah monitored the quantum readings and called out updates in a voice that remained steady through sheer force of will. Coherence levels holding at 93%. And the cascade structure is responding exactly as predicted so far being the critical phrase. Marcus muttered under his breath before speaking louder to address the fleet. All ships deploy disruption devices in 3, 2, 1. Mark throughout the fleet, specialized containers opened and released machines that humanity had built using principles stolen from a dozen different alien technologies and combined in ways their original creators had never imagined. The devices activated simultaneously in space itself screamed in protest as quantum disruptions rippled through the cascade structure like cracks. Spreading through ice, the Council observers watched their sensors spike into ranges that should not be possible. And several delegates made sounds of distress in their native languages, because the readings suggested that the humans had just made everything catastrophically worse. "The cascade is expanding," a Zarkathi scientist announced, with panic clear in his voice. "Its growth rate has increased by 40% in the last 30 seconds. Zarthan felt his heart sink because he had allowed himself to hope that the humans might somehow succeed despite all logic suggesting otherwise. Now he would have. To watch an entire species die because the Council had been desperate enough to approve their mad plan. Inside the cascade, the human fleet fought to maintain position as forces beyond comprehension pulled at their ships from every direction. And Marcus watched his damage reports climb as systems failed under the impossible stress hull integrity down to 60%. His tactical officer called out, "We cannot sustain this for much longer. Hold position," Marcus ordered firmly. "Sarah, how much longer do we need?" Sarah stared at her readings with wide eyes because the numbers were not making sense in ways that both terrified and excited her. "The cascade is reacting, but not how I expected, and I need another 2 minutes. To understand what is happening, you have 90 seconds. Marcus told her. "After that, we will not have ships capable of escaping even if we wanted to." The fleet held their positions through sheer determination as the cascade raged around them. And one by one, ships began reporting critical failures that forced them to fall back or risk complete destruction. The Council observers prepared to witness the end of humanity's desperate gamble, and several delegates began composing the eulogies that tradition demanded for fallen warriors. Then something changed. Cascade's expansion suddenly stopped mid-pulse, as if reality itself had frozen. And for 3 heartbeats nothing happened. "It's working," Sarah whispered in disbelief. "The disruptions are cascading through the coherence matrix, and the whole structure is beginning to collapse inward." Marcus did not let himself believe it until he saw the sensor readings confirm what Sarah described. And then he allowed himself a grim smile. "All ships withdraw immediately," he ordered. "Get clear of the collapse zone before this thing takes us with it." The human fleet turned and burned their engines at maximum power to escape the dying phenomenon. And behind them, the void cascade began eating itself as the quantum disruption spread through its structure. Like a virus, the Council observers could only watch in a state of amazement as the impossible happened before their eyes, and the phenomenon that had threatened to consume the galaxy simply ceased to exist. The human fleet limped back to Rally Point Theta with half their ships, showing critical damage and 3 vessels requiring emergency towing. But they came back alive and victorious. When every prediction had suggested they would simply cease to exist, Commander Marcus Webb stood in the medical bay of the Indomitable getting treatment for radiation burns that he had not even noticed receiving during the mission. And he reviewed the casualty reports with the grim satisfaction of a commander who had expected far worse. 17 dead and 43 seriously injured, the medical officer reported, while sealing the burns on Marcus's arms. "Considering we flew into something that unmakes matter at the quantum level, I would say we got off lightly." Marcus nodded in agreement because he had commanded operations with far higher casualties that accomplished far less. And he knew that every person who had volunteered for this mission understood the risks the Council had already sent. 5 different delegations to interview the returning crews and examine the sensor logs. And Marcus could hear the confusion and disbelief in every question they asked. Sarah Chen sat in the ship's main conference room surrounded by scientists from 8 different species who all tried to understand how humanity had succeeded where their own civilizations had failed. "But the mathematics do not support this outcome," insisted a Lumine researcher whose crystalline structure pulsed with frustrated confusion. "According to every model we constructed, your disruption devices Should have accelerated the cascade's expansion, not reversed it. Sarah rubbed her tired eyes and tried to explain, for the 5th time, something that she herself barely understood. Your models assumed the cascade operated on principles of quantum mechanics that follow predictable patterns. But what we discovered is that the phenomenon was actually more chaotic than anyone realized as Arcathy physicist clicked his mandibles in the pattern that indicated deep skepticism. Chaos does not explain how you calculated the exact placement and timing of your disruption devices with the precision necessary to achieve resonance cascade failure. That is because we did not calculate it exactly, Sarah admitted, and her words created a stunned silence in the conference room that stretched for several. With the Zarkathy repeated slowly, as if he suspected the translation device had malfunctioned. Then how did you determine the deployment parameters? Sarah pulled up holographic displays, showing the mission telemetry, and pointed to dozens of moments where the human ships had adjusted their positions and timing on the fly. We made educated guesses based on real-time sensor data, she explained. Every 30 seconds we recalculated our approach based on how the cascade responded to our previous actions, and we adjusted our strategy accordingly. The assembled scientists stared at her with expressions that ranged from shock to something approaching horror. And finally, the Luminae researcher managed to speak. You improvised, she asked in a voice that sounded like breaking glass. You flew into an extinction-level phenomenon and improvised your response? Yes, Sarah confirmed simply, because we did not have time to develop perfect calculations, and even if we did, the cascade was changing too rapidly for any pre-planned strategy to work. Commander Karras had been standing quietly in the corner of the conference room listening to the exchange, and now he stepped forward with his massive frame dominating the space. This is how humans fight, said with a tone that mixed respect with disbelief. You do not plan every detail before battle, but instead adapt to changing conditions in real time. That is part of it. Marcus agreed from where he stood near the doorway, having just arrived from the medical bay. But more importantly, we accept that we cannot predict everything. And sometimes you have to try something even when you are not certain it will work. Zarthon entered the conference room at that moment with all 4 of his arms carrying data tablets, and his expression showed the confusion that his entire species felt about humanity's success. I've reviewed every sensor log and telemetry report from your mission, he announced to the assembled group. And I must confess that I still do not understand how you succeeded when our own attempts failed so completely. Marcus moved to stand beside Sarah, and together they faced the council's representative with the quiet confidence of people who had just accomplished the impossible. The difference is that you tried to understand the cascade perfectly before acting against it, Marcus explained. But we accepted that perfect understanding was impossible and acted anyway, based on incomplete information that is illogical. How can you formulate an effective strategy without complete data? Sarah smiled slightly and called up a new holographic display that showed humanity's history of exploration and innovation. Our species has a saying, she told the assembled scientists. Perfect is the enemy of good, and what it means is that waiting for perfect conditions or perfect knowledge often prevents you from achieving anything at all. She highlighted various moments in human history where incomplete knowledge had not stopped innovation and progress. When we went to our moon, we did not fully understand radiation exposure in space, Sarah continued. When we developed quantum computers, we did not completely comprehend quantum mechanics, and when we created artificial intelligence, we did not know how consciousness truly worked. But we tried anyway, and we learned from our mistakes, the Zarkathy physicist clicked his mandibles in a pattern that indicated he was reconsidering his fundamental assumptions. So you are saying that your willingness to act with incomplete information is actually an advantage? In some situations, yes, Marcus confirmed, because while you were running simulations and building perfect models, the cascade was consuming more systems and more lives. So we chose imperfect action over perfect inaction, Chancellor. Vex materialized in the conference room in a flash of light that made several scientists jump in surprise, and her crystalline form vibrated with harmonics that indicated she was deeply troubled. The Council has reviewed your success, and we are grateful beyond measure, she said formally. But we are also concerned because your methods seem to violate every principle of careful scientific advancement that has guided galactic civilization for millions of years. Marcus met her gaze steadily and spoke with the blunt honesty that humanity had become known for during their short time in the Council. Maybe that is your problem, he suggested. Maybe being careful and methodical works well when you have unlimited time. But when faced with extinction, sometimes you need to be bold and willing to fail. The conference room fell silent as every being present considered the implications of what the human commander had just said, because it challenged assumptions that had guided galactic society since before humanity had even evolved. Zarthan broke the silence by speaking in a quiet voice that carried more weight than any shout. You saved billions of lives using methods that we would never have approved if we had truly understood what you intended to do. Yes, Sarah agreed without apology. Because if we had explained that we planned to improvise our strategy in real time while flying through a phenomenon that breaks the laws of physics, you would have stopped us, we would have, Vex confirmed. And in doing so, we would have doomed ourselves to slow extinction through evacuation. Kara's laughed suddenly, a deep rumbling sound that filled the conference room. The young species teaches the old ones a lesson in courage and adaptability, and we are all alive to learn from it. The other scientists began to leave the conference room in small groups, discussing among themselves what humanity's success meant for their own approaches to problem-solving. But Zarthan remained behind with Marcus and Sarah. The Council will want to study your methods extensively, he told them. And I suspect many species will need time to accept that careful planning is not always superior to bold action. Marcus nodded in understanding because he knew that changing the thinking of entire civilizations would take time. But he also knew that humanity had just proven something important. The universe does not care about our careful plans, Marcus said. It throws problems at us that do not have perfect solutions, and sometimes the only way forward is to try something crazy and hope it works. Sarah added her own observation with a slight smile. Besides, we have found that the universe tends to reward those who are willing to take calculated risks rather than those who wait for perfect safety. Zarthan studied the two humans for a long moment before speaking again. Your species has been part of the Council for only 20 years, and already you have changed how we think about solving impossible problems. And I wonder what other assumptions you will challenge in the years to come. Probably all of them, Marcus replied with a grin, because that is what humans do best. 6 months after humanity stopped the void cascade, the galaxy enjoyed a period of relative peace and prosperity. But that peace shattered when the long-range sensors detected something that made the cascade look like a minor inconvenience. The Khazir swarm had arrived, Commander. Marcus Webb stood in the Council's war room studying tactical displays that showed a threat unlike anything the galaxy had faced before. And even his considerable combat experience left him struggling to find any weakness in what he saw. They have consumed 3 entire galaxies. Admiral Vex, of the Vorash Defense Fleet, explained while pointing to the holographic star map. And every species that attempted to resist them was completely destroyed within weeks. The display showed wave after wave of Khazir vessels spreading through space like a plague. And what made them truly terrifying was not their numbers, but their ability to adapt to any attack within minutes of encountering at Dr. Sarah. Chen reviewed the combat reports from species that had fought the swarm in other galaxies, and her face grew paler with each file she read. They are a true hive mind, she reported to the assembled military commanders. Every individual unit shares information instantly with the collective, so when you destroy one ship using a specific weapon, every other ship immediately develops immunity too. That weapon? Zarthan clicked his mandibles in a pattern that indicated extreme distress. Our unified defense fleet engaged them at the border systems 3 days ago. We lost 70% of our forces before we managed to retreat. The tactical display showed the battle in brutal detail as Council ships attacked the swarm, using every weapon and strategy in their considerable arsenal. And for the first few minutes, the defensive forces actually won victories and destroyed numerous swarm vessels, but then the swarm adapted energy. Weapons that had been effective suddenly became useless as the swarm ships developed shields that absorbed the attacks. And kinetic weapons failed when the swarm vessels altered their hull composition too. Deflect projectiles, they learn faster than we can adjust our tactics, Admiral Dex continued grimly. By the end of the engagement, our weapons were completely ineffective, and we could do nothing but run. Chancellor Vex floated at the head of the conference table, and her crystalline form dimmed with sorrow. The projections suggest the swarm will reach our core worlds within 4 months, and we have no strategy that accounts for an enemy that adapts to everything we use against it. Commander Karras slammed his fist against the table hard enough to crack the surface. Then we hit them with everything at once, before they can adapt, and we do not give them time to learn. Illumine military strategist dimmed her light in disagreement. We tried that approach in the border engagement, and the swarm adapted to multiple attack vectors simultaneously. And by the third wave of attacks, nothing worked anymore. Marcus studied the tactical data with the focused intensity of someone looking for any detail that might provide an advantage. And he noticed something odd in the swarm's combat patterns. They adapt to perfectly, he muttered to himself. But Sarah heard him and looked up from her own analysis. What do you mean? She asked Marcus, highlighted several sections of the combat footage where swarm ships responded to council attacks. Look at how they adjust their defenses, and they always choose the most efficient counter to whatever we throw at them because they're hive mind. It calculates the optimal response instantly. That is what makes them so deadly, Zarthon agreed. They are perfectly coordinated and perfectly efficient. Exactly. Marcus said with a slight smile that made Sarah's eyes widen because she recognized that expression from their time dealing with the Void Cascade. They are perfect, and that is their weakness. The war room fell silent as every being present tried to understand what the human commander meant. And finally, Kara's voiced the question that everyone wanted to ask: how is perfection a weakness? He demanded. Perfect adaptation and perfect efficiency should be unbeatable. Sarah suddenly understood what Marcus was suggesting, and she brought up her own displays showing human military history. Because perfection only works against opponents who follow predictable patterns. She showed footage of human battles throughout history, where smaller forces defeated larger ones. Using tactics that seemed illogical or even suicidal, our species learned long ago that the best way to fight a superior opponent is to be unpredictable. Marcus took over the presentation and highlighted, when we fought wars on Earth against enemies with better technology, we survived by refusing to follow any consistent strategy, and every battle looked different, because we used whatever worked in that specific moment. Admiral Dex studied the human combat footage with growing interest. You are suggesting we abandon unified strategy and instead fight the swarm using random tactics? Not random, Marcus corrected. Unpredictable. And there is a difference, because random is chaos, but unpredictable is organized in ways that the enemy cannot anticipate or model. Zarthon's mandibles clicked in a pattern that indicated he was thinking through the implications. The swarm's hive mind is designed to analyze patterns and develop optimal counters, but if there are no consistent patterns to analyze, then their advantage becomes meaningless. Precisely, Sarah confirmed. Their perfect adaptation only works if they can predict what we will do next. But if every ship uses different tactics and different weapons and switches strategies constantly, then the swarm cannot adapt fast enough. Chancellor Vex's crystalline structure vibrated with uncertainty. What you describe contradicts every principle of military coordination that has kept the Council's forces effective for millions of years. I know, Marcus acknowledged, and I am not suggesting we throw away all coordination, but we need to embrace controlled chaos instead of rigid doctrine. The war room erupted in argument as military commanders from different species debated whether humanity's suggestion was brilliant or insane. And many voices argued that abandoning proven strategies would lead to disaster. Commander Karras finally roared for silence, and his voice cut through the chaos like a blade. The humans stopped the void cascade using methods we thought were impossible, and perhaps it is time we trusted their instincts again. Zarkathi General clicked his mandibles skeptically. You want us to bet the survival of galactic civilization on uncoordinated chaos? I want us to recognize that fighting an enemy that adapts to everything means we need to be adaptable to, Kara's replied. And rigid military doctrine is the opposite of adaptability. Sarah brought up detailed tactical proposals that humanity had been developing since they first learned about the swarm. We are not suggesting complete chaos, but rather organized unpredictability where each ship or squadron operates independently within broad strategic goals. The proposals showed how different species could use their unique capabilities in ways that did not follow any predictable pattern, and how rapid switching between tactics could keep the swarm constantly off balance. Eden Myril, Dex studied the plans carefully, and his expression gradually shifted from skepticism to cautious interest. This could work, but it requires every commander to think independently and make tactical decisions without waiting for central coordination. That is asking our forces to unlearn millions of years of military training, a Lumine officer protested. Our strength has always been perfect coordination and unified strategy. Marcus met her objection head-on with typical human bluntness. And that strength became a weakness the moment you faced an enemy that could adapt to unified strategy. Because now your perfect coordination just makes you predictable. The debate continued for hours with passionate arguments on both sides. And Marcus watched as military officers struggled with concepts that challenged everything they had been taught. Finally, Chancellor Vex called for a vote on whether to implement humanity's proposed strategy, and the room fell into tense silence. As each species considered their choice, the swarm will reach our outer colonies in 6 weeks. Vex reminded everyone, we must decide now whether to face them with conventional tactics that have already failed, or embrace the uncertainty of humanity's approach. Zarthon was the first to speak, and his voice carried the weight of someone making a decision that would affect billions. The Zarkathi support the human proposal because waiting for certain death is not a strategy. I can accept one by one other species added their support until finally the vote passed with a narrow margin, and humanity's strategy of controlled chaos became the galaxy's last desperate hope. Marcus looked at Sarah, and they both knew that they had just convinced multiple ancient civilizations to abandon millions of years of military doctrine. Based on humanity's 20 years of experience, this had better work. Sarah whispered, "It will." Marcus replied with more confidence than he truly felt. Because the alternative is extinction, and humans have never been very good at accepting extinction. The final battle began at the Nexus Point, where 3 major hyperspace lanes intersected. And Commander Marcus Webb watched from the Bridge of the Indomitable as the largest military force in galactic history assembled for what would either be their greatest victory or their final stand-all. Fleet elements report ready status, his tactical officer announced. We have forces from all 12 council species, plus independent militias from 40 colony worlds. The view screen showed thousands of ships from dozens of different civilizations arranged not in the precise formations that military doctrine demanded, but in loose clusters that could move independently. And Marcus knew that every traditional military commander watching felt deeply uncomfortable with what they saw at Ursera. Chen monitored the quantum communication networks that linked the various fleet elements. The swarm has been detected at the edge of the system. They are advancing in standard formation. Standard for them means perfectly coordinated, Marcus noted, which gives us about 20 minutes before they reach engagement range. He activated the fleet-wide channel and spoke to thousands of crews in hundreds of different languages, all translated simultaneously. This is Commander Webb to all ships, and you all know the strategy by now. So, I will keep this brief because humans are not good at long speeches anyway. Nervous laughter rippled through several channels because humor in the face of extinction was a very human trait. And some species had learned to appreciate it. The swarm expects us to fight like we always have, with perfect coordination and predictable tactics, Marcus continued. So instead we are going to fight like humans, and that means doing whatever works in the moment, even if it seems crazy. Commander Kara's broadcast from his flagship in the Vorish battle group. My people have been waiting centuries for an enemy worthy of our full strength, and today we will show the swarm what it means to face warriors who embrace chaos. The swarm entered visual range, and the sight of them made even veteran soldiers feel a chill of fear, because the enemy ships moved with mechanical precision in formations that seemed to cover every possible angle of attack. They outnumber us 3-2. One, the tactical officer, reported unnecessarily, because everyone could see the disparity on their displays. Good, Marcus replied calmly. More targets to shoot at. And remember that we are not trying to destroy them all at once, but just trying to confuse them long enough to find their weaknesses. The swarm opened fire first, with coordinated volleys of energy weapons that would have devastated any conventional fleet. But the Council forces scattered in dozens of different directions instead of holding formation. Human ships dove toward the swarm at full acceleration, while Vorash vessels angled away and began flanking maneuvers. And Luminae cruisers activated cloaking systems that had not been used in actual combat for thousands of years. Target their command ships. One admiral ordered his forces ignore the command ships and hit their supply vessels. Another commander countered formation scatter pattern Delta. A third group executed. The swarm adapted quickly to the initial attacks, and their shields adjusted to block the energy weapons that most species favored. But then a human frigate fired old-fashioned explosive missiles that punched through the adapted shields, because the swarm had not encountered chemical explosives in centuries before the swarm could adapt to missiles of Voresh. Battleship rammed directly into a cluster of enemy vessels using its armored prow as a weapon, and the impact destroyed 3 swarm ships that had never calculated someone would use their own hull as ammunition. The battle descended into beautiful chaos as each species rediscovered tactics they had abandoned as primitive, and the swarm's perfect coordination became a liability, because every adaptation they made was immediately countered by something completely different. Syrah monitored the tactical data and called out observations to Marcus. Between attacks, they are trying to find patterns in our movements, but there are no patterns to find. Keep it that way, Marcus ordered while directing the Indomitable through a maneuver that no tactical computer would have recommended. All human ships switch weapon types every 30 seconds and do not use the same attack twice in a row. Zarkathi cruiser that had been retreating suddenly reversed course and launched a spread of quantum mines that the swarm had marked as a defeated opponent, and the resulting explosions destroyed an entire swarm squadron. Luminae discovered that, rapidly shifting the frequency of their energy weapons created a strobing effect that the swarm's sensors could not track effectively, and they began targeting ships seemingly at random, which made the swarm's predictive algorithms useless. Commander Karras led his Vorash forces in what human history would have called a cavalry charge, with his ships accelerating to ramming speed before releasing their entire payload of kinetic weapons and then using their momentum to smash through the swarm formation. This is madness, Admiral Vex shouted over the communication channel, but his voice carried exhilaration rather than criticism. And it is working. The swarm tried desperately to adapt, but every adjustment they made became obsolete within seconds, as Council forces switched tactics faster than the hive mind could process. And for the first time in its existence across 3 galaxies, the swarm began to falter. Marcus watched the tactical display show something unprecedented as swarm ships actually retreated from an engagement. And he knew they had found the weakness. They cannot handle true chaos, he announced to the fleet. Their hive mind is too efficient, and it needs patterns to function, but we are not giving them any patterns. Sarah highlighted sections of the swarm formation where their coordination was breaking down. They are trying to fragment into smaller groups that can adapt independently, but that contradicts their fundamental nature. Push them harder, Marcus ordered. Do not give them time to reorganize. The Council fleet pressed their advantage with renewed vigor as species that had fought together for millennia suddenly fought like they had never trained together at all. And the paradox of organized unpredictability became their greatest weapon. A human destroyer executed a maneuver that looked like a retreat before doubling back and targeting a swarm vessel from below, while a Zarkathi frigate used mining lasers instead of military weapons. because the swarm had never encountered industrial tools used as arms illuminae, coordinated with human ships to create a crossfire pattern that changed every 3 seconds. And Vorash boarding parties actually launched themselves at swarm vessels using personal jetpacks because who attacks a spaceship with infantry? The battle raged for 6 hours, and at some point it stopped being a traditional military engagement and became something closer to performance art where every ship improvised their role. And the swarm's perfect efficiency shattered against the wall of creative chaos. Their formation is collapsing. The tactical officer reported with undisguised amazement. The swarm is retreating. Marcus did not let himself believe it until he saw the enemy ships actually turn away and accelerate out of the system. And even then, he kept his fleet on high alert because retreating could be a tactic, but the swarm did not return, and long-range sensors confirmed they had left Council space entirely. And slowly the reality of what had happened began to sink in across thousands of ships. "We won," Sarah whispered in disbelief. "We actually won." The fleet communication channels erupted in celebration. Species that had expected to die instead found themselves victorious. And for the first time in Council history, the professional military discipline completely broke down as crews cheered and shouted and celebrated. Commander Kara's broadcast a message that summed up what every warrior in the fleet felt. "Today we learned that perfect coordination is no match for creative chaos. And I will never again underestimate the value of unpredictability." The Galactic Council could only watch in a state of amazement as the impossible became reality for the second time in 6 months. And once again, humanity had shown them that ancient assumptions could be challenged in the aftermath. Marcus stood on the bridge of the Indomitable and looked out at the gathered fleet where ships from 12 species floated together in a formation that would have made any military instructor weep. But that formation had just saved the Galaxazorthan sent a personal message to Marcus that appeared on his private channel. "Your species has been part of the Council for barely 20 years, and already you have changed our entire approach to solving impossible problems." "We just did what humans always do," Marcus replied honestly. "We looked at a situation that seemed hopeless, and we tried something crazy. Because doing nothing was not an option, perhaps. That is what the galaxy needed," Zarthon suggested. "A species young enough to still believe that impossible just means nobody has succeeded yet." Sarah joined Marcus at the view screen, and together they watched as the victory celebration continued across hundreds of ships. And she spoke quietly, so only he could hear. "They are going to want us to teach them how to think like humans.